He swept the marble floors long after the office lights had dimmed. His name was Daniel Cole, but almost no one in the towering building remembered it. To most, he was simply the janitor. He moved silently, bent slightly from years of work, pushing his mop with the patience of someone used to being invisible. Yet behind his tired eyes, a fire burned that no one suspected. Daniel had once devoured books late into the night, ancient texts, rare languages, lost alphabets. He could read fragments of Sanskrit inscriptions, translate Coptic gospels, decipher forgotten dialects of Eastern Europe. His passion was not for profit, but for knowledge itself. But knowledge had not paid the medical bills when his wife grew ill. Knowledge had not covered the hospital fees when their daughter needed surgery. And so, Daniel had taken the job no one else wanted, cleaning the offices of Harrow and Blackwell, one of the most powerful financial firms in the city. The executives barely looked at him. If they did, it was only to complain that a window streak hadn't been wiped perfectly, or that the coffee room floor smelled faintly of bleach. Among them, none was more arrogant than Richard Harrow, the firm's CEO. Richard was tall, impeccably dressed, his cufflinks engraved with his initials, his voice sharp like the edge of a blade. To him, employees were chess pieces, some useful, most replaceable. And janitors? They were dust, background noise, the kind of people he stepped around without seeing. Daniel endured it. He needed the paycheck. He needed the health insurance. So he bowed his head and kept moving, his hands raw from chemicals, his back aching from bending. One morning, the office trembled with unusual energy. Suits hurried in and out of conference rooms. Phones rang endlessly. Richard Harrow stormed down the hallway, barking orders that only sowed confusion. Daniel, polishing a brass handle near the boardroom, overheard fragments. Crucial acquisition? Documents arrived early. We can't understand a word. Richard slammed the boardroom door behind him, leaving a trail of tension in his wake. Daniel lingered for a moment, cloth in hand, his curiosity piqued. Documents? Language? His heart stirred with the faintest pulse of recognition. Inside the boardroom, panic grew. Spread across the long mahogany table were dozens of sheets, stamped with the emblem of a foreign government. Lines of dense script covered them, archaic, looping letters, interlaced with obscure references. They were contracts tied to a billion-dollar mining deal overseas. If the firm could secure the rights, profits would soar. But if they failed to respond within 72 hours, the deal would collapse, taking Harrow and Blackwell's reputation with it. Why hasn't anyone translated this yet? Richard demanded, slamming his palm against the table. We've contacted the embassy, sir, stammered his assistant. But the experts need weeks. And even then, we don't have weeks. Richard's voice cracked like a whip. If we can't submit a counterproposal by Friday, we lose everything. The lawyers shrugged helplessly. The analysts avoided his gaze. No one had the skill. That night, Daniel pushed his cleaning cart into the boardroom. Papers still littered the table, abandoned in frustration. He paused. His pulse quickened as he recognized the script, a hybrid of Old Church Slavonic and a regional dialect he had once studied obsessively in university. Long before life had crushed his dreams, he ran a calloused finger over the words. They were dense but legible, like an old friend calling to him from the past. For a moment, he stood frozen, mop forgotten. He could translate this. He could unravel the knot that had left the firm paralyzed. But he also knew what would happen. They would laugh. Who would believe the janitor could read what their lawyers and consultants could not? Still, something in him stirred. A defiance. A refusal to remain unseen forever. The next morning, chaos reigned again. Richard's face was pale with fury. If we can't solve this, our competitors will eat us alive, he spat. Daniel stood by the door, collecting trash bins. His chest pounded. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but quiet. "I can help," he said. The room froze. Heads turned toward him with disbelief. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me?" "The documents," Daniel continued, swallowing hard. "I can read them. The language old Slavonic roots mixed with a regional dialect. I studied it. I can translate." Laughter erupted around the table. One of the analysts nearly choked on his coffee. "The janitor? Translate multi-billion-dollar contracts?" Richard smirked cruelly. "That's cute, Daniel. But unless your mock doubles as a law degree, I think we'll manage without your services." A flush rose on Daniel's face, but he did not retreat. "You've tried everything else," he said softly. "What do you have to lose?" For the first time, silence fell. Richard glared at him, lips tight, weighing humiliation against desperation. Finally, with a sharp gesture, he shoved the papers across the table. "Fine," he snapped. "Entertain us." Daniel sat, his rough hands trembling slightly as he arranged the documents. The suits leaned back, amused, waiting for him to fail. He drew a breath and began. The words unfolded effortlessly. Clauses, conditions, veiled traps hidden within the ornate phrasing. Daniel explained them in precise English, his voice calm, almost hypnotic. He revealed how the contract attempted to disguise exploitative royalties, how the clauses locked the firm into obligations spanning decades. He even pointed out cultural references that would have escaped a casual reader, phrases with double meanings tied to centuries-old traditions. The room grew still. Jokes died on lips. Pens stopped tapping. One by one, the analysts leaned forward, scribbling notes furiously. Richard's smirk faded. By the time Daniel finished, sweat glistened on his brow, but his eyes were clear. "They're baiting you," he concluded. "If you sign as is, you'll bleed money for years. But if you counter with these 3 changes," he pointed to the clauses, "they will have no choice but to accept. It respects their cultural pride while protecting your interests." The silence was electric. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low, shaken. "My God, he's right. What followed was a frenzy." Executives scrambled to draft the counterproposal exactly as Daniel advised. Hours later, a secure message was sent overseas. By morning, the foreign delegates responded with stunned approval. The deal was saved, no, not just saved, but rewritten in Harrow and Blackwell's favor. Richard Harrow was hailed as a genius negotiator. The board congratulated him. Investors cheered. Yet beneath the applause, one truth remained undeniable. The janitor had done what no one else could. Daniel returned to his cart, his hands still smelling of bleach. For years, he had been invisible. Now, for the first time, all eyes were on him. But recognition did not come gently. Richard called him into his office that evening. For once, the CEO's arrogance faltered. He studied Daniel with something close to awe and unease. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, not as an insult, but as a genuine question. Daniel met his gaze. "I'm the man who cleans your floors," he said quietly, "and the man who just saved your company." Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. His empire had been rescued not by lawyers or analysts, but by someone he had dismissed as nothing. It was a mirror held to his arrogance, and the reflection unsettled him. Yet Richard's pride was not so easily dismantled. The next day, he announced the firm's victory in a triumphant speech, barely mentioning Daniel by name. Employees applauded Richard's leadership, unaware of the truth. Daniel, standing in the back with his mop, felt the familiar sting of invisibility return. But whispers spread. Secretaries who had witnessed the translation told others. Analysts admitted that Daniel had guided the entire process. The story trickled through the building like smoke through cracks. The janitor who had saved $1 billion deal. Soon, no one looked at Daniel the same way. Richard could feel the shift. His authority, once absolute, now seemed fragile. The more Daniel's name surfaced, the more Richard realized his power had been built on illusions, shattered by a man with a mop and a mind sharper than any of his executives. And Daniel, though humble, was no longer willing to bow his head. The whispers became impossible to ignore. At first, they were muttered in corridors, passed between assistants in the break room. But soon, they spread like wildfire. A janitor who read the unreadable. A man who cracked a code that armies of lawyers could not. Employees who had never once acknowledged Daniel now glanced at him with curiosity, even admiration. Richard Harrow hated it. He had built his empire on the illusion that he was untouchable, the one with all the answers. Now people were whispering a different name Daniel's. Every time he walked through the office, Richard could feel it, the shift in gravity, the erosion of his control. But Richard was a man who clung to power like a drowning man to driftwood. He decided to crush the story before it grew beyond repair. One morning, he summoned Daniel to his office. The blinds were drawn, the air heavy with cologne and tension. Richard folded his hands on the desk. "You did something useful," he admitted, his voice grudging. "I won't deny that. But let's be clear. You're a janitor. You work here because you mop the floors, not because you speak in dead tongues." Daniel remained standing, his calloused hands clasped in front of him. "I never asked for more," he said simply. "I only offered help when you needed it." Richard's lips curved in a cold smile. "Exactly. And now your part is finished. If I hear you speaking about this to anyone, if I catch you basking in some fantasy of recognition, I'll make sure you never work in this city again. Do you understand?" For a moment, the old Daniel, the invisible man, wanted to nod, to retreat back into silence. But something in him had shifted. The humiliation of years, the weight of invisibility had cracked. "No," Daniel said quietly. Richard blinked. "No, I won't be silent anymore," Daniel continued. His voice trembled, but not with fear, with conviction. "You've treated everyone in this building like they're nothing. You think titles make you superior. But yesterday proved otherwise. Without me, your deal would be ashes. And the truth has a way of spreading, whether you like it or not." Richard rose from his chair, fury boiling in his eyes. "Careful, Cole. Don't mistake a single trick for power. Men like you are replaceable." Daniel held his gaze. "And men like you are fallible." For the first time in years, Richard Harrow had no retort. The days that followed marked the unraveling of his control. Staff who once bowed to Richard now looked at Daniel with a strange reverence. Assistants slipped him smiles. Analysts nodded respectfully. Even senior partners, though careful not to anger the CEO, made quiet efforts to thank Daniel in private. And then came the inevitable. Another crisis. A week later, the firm was struck again. An encrypted file from an overseas partner arrived, locked with a code no one could break. The IT department tried and failed. External consultants demanded weeks and exorbitant fees. Richard was cornered once more, his empire on the verge of embarrassment. When Daniel passed by the server room, carrying his mop, he heard the frustration boiling inside. He hesitated, then stepped in. "I can try," he said. The IT manager scoffed. "This isn't language, it's math. Complex encryption." Daniel studied the screen. Numbers cascaded like waterfalls, letters shifting in patterns. But to him, it was not chaos. His memory photographic relentless clicked into place. He recalled obscure journals he had once pored over, theories of pattern recognition, number sequences tied to historical ciphers. Within minutes, he began to type. The room grew silent as he unraveled the code with uncanny speed, explaining each step as though he were guiding children through a simple puzzle. Lines of encrypted nonsense transformed into clear contracts. Gasps filled the room. The IT manager stared. How? How did you? Daniel shrugged. Some puzzles are just waiting for the right eyes. By the time Richard heard what had happened, it was too late. The story spread faster than before. Not once, but twice, the janitor had done the impossible. Twice he had saved the firm. And this time, even Richard could not bury the truth. At the next board meeting, one of the partners spoke up. We need to recognize him, Richard, publicly. The clients know. The staff know. If we ignore this, we look like fools. Richard's jaw clenched. Every bone in his body resisted. But he also knew the truth. If he denied Daniel again, his own credibility would shatter. So, with a forced smile, he announced at the company-wide assembly, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary contribution of one of our own, Daniel Cole, whose unusual skills have proven invaluable in recent weeks. His efforts have secured victories that no one else could have achieved." Applause thundered. Daniel stood awkwardly, unsure whether to bow or smile. For the first time in years, he felt seen. But beneath the applause, Richard's eyes burned with something darker, envy. Recognition brought change. The partners offered Daniel a position as a consultant, with a salary that eclipsed anything he had ever dreamed of. He could finally afford the treatments his daughter still needed. He could move his family out of the cramped apartment that smelled of damp walls and forgotten dreams. Yet Daniel hesitated. He had spent so long cleaning floors, invisible and mocked. Could he really step into the light? When he told his daughter, her eyes filled with tears. "Dad," she whispered, "you've spent your whole life taking care of us. Let them see who you really are." And so he accepted. The transformation was swift. No longer in overalls, Daniel walked the halls in tailored suits, his posture taller, his voice steadier. Employees who once looked through him now stopped to ask his opinion. He was invited into meetings, into decisions that shaped futures. But the change was not only external. Inside, Daniel wrestled with something deeper, the bitterness of years spent unseen. He wondered if recognition was enough to heal old wounds. And Richard watched with growing unease. The third crisis sealed it. An international delegation arrived for high-stakes negotiations. The firm's lawyers stumbled, their arguments collapsing under cultural missteps. The deal was slipping away, millions poised to vanish. And then Daniel spoke, calm, deliberate, weaving his knowledge of history, language, and negotiation into a tapestry that dazzled the room. He addressed the delegates in their native tongue, not with stiff formality, but with warmth, respect, and precision. He cited their poets, their traditions, their unspoken codes of honor. The delegates, stunned, shifted from suspicion to admiration. The contract was not only saved, but expanded, granting Harrow and Blackwell privileges beyond expectation. The room erupted in celebration. But this time, no one credited Richard. They all turned to Daniel. Richard's arrogance, once unshakable, cracked under the weight of truth. He stood in the corner, watching the man he had mocked become the savior of his empire. For the first time, he felt small. That night, alone in his office, Richard poured himself a drink. His reflection in the glass walls mocked him. He had treated people as disposable. He had built his throne on contempt. And yet, the man he had scorned, the janitor, was everything he pretended to be. Something inside him broke. The next morning, Richard called Daniel into his office again. But this time, his voice was quiet. His shoulders sagged. "I was wrong," he admitted, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. "I've been blind. I thought arrogance made me strong. But it only made me weak. You've shown me what true strength looks like." Daniel studied him, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I can't erase how I treated you," Richard continued, eyes lowered, "but I can change what I do now. I want to learn from you." For the first time, Richard Harrow sounded human. The change did not happen overnight, but slowly it spread. Richard began to listen, truly listen, to his staff. He asked questions instead of barking orders. He gave credit where it was due. And the culture of Harrow and Blackwell began to shift from fear to respect, from arrogance to collaboration. And Daniel? He used his new position not to dominate, but to lift others. He mentored interns. He defended the overlooked. He made sure no one in the building would ever feel invisible the way he had. Years later, the story became legend. The janitor who saved the empire. The man who turned arrogance into humility. Clients spoke of it with awe. Employees retold it to newcomers like a parable. But for Daniel, the truest reward was quieter. His daughter's health stabilized. His wife, once frail, found peace in knowing they were secure. His family laughed again around the dinner table, free from the weight of survival. One evening, as Daniel walked past the office he once cleaned, he paused. The floors gleamed, but another janitor pushed the mop now. Daniel stopped to greet him, to thank him, because he knew what it meant to be unseen. And in that moment, he realized his journey had not just been about recognition. It had been about dignity, about proving that worth is not measured by titles, but by the depth of unseen brilliance waiting to be recognized. Epilogue in the end, Daniel Cole's story was not one of sudden wealth or titles, though those came. It was about the quiet power of persistence, the hidden brilliance in overlooked lives, and the transformation of even the most arrogant hearts. The janitor had become the master, and the world would never forget.